Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Boom. All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. I'm Peter Limberg, the steward of the Stoa. The Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And today we got Noam Chomsky visiting us in this digital colonnade that we have here. So for those of you who are new at the Stoa or might be watching for the first time, a question that gets commonly asked is, what is the Stoa? And it's one of the great mysteries of the internet currently. Some call it a digital campfire, communal podcast. We have a wisdom gym, sense maker in residency series, and a really beautiful sense of community emerging along with lots of beautiful people. So like I said, we have Chomsky visiting us, and Chomsky is many things: philosopher, social critic, linguist. He's the author of numerous books, including Manufacturing Consent, and most recently, Requiem for the American Dream. And the title for today's session was from an essay he wrote, I think it was in the 60s or 70s, called The Responsibility of Intellectuals, right here, to speak the truth and to expose lies. And this session was originally designed and framed as sort of a career retrospect, but it can go kind of pretty much anywhere it likes to go, really. And it's going to be a little different for those of you who've been to a typical Stoa format before. We have, I've invited past guests and sense makers at the Stoa to ask Noam questions with one follow-up. And then if we have time, we're going to source the questions from the Stoa community, which is going to be on the Discord. And I will post that in the chats. So don't throw your questions in the Zoom chat. We don't have, there's too much people for that today. Yeah, so I think I have everything. Oh yeah, we have a few co-hosts, Raven, maybe Margaret, maybe you can give a wave. So if people start doing weird things on the video or in the chat, they're going to kick you out. So be nice and polite, because Professor Chomsky is here and he's very, very gracious with his time. So that being said, Noam, welcome to the Stoa. Let me ask you to unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself, or is that, yeah.
How's that?
That's great.
Good.
So before we jump into Q&As, do you have any general kind of opening thoughts or anything you'd like to share with us?
Too many to try to share. I'd rather listen to you.
Great. So we'll start with the first question. It's going to be from a past guest at the Stoa, associate professor at OCAD in the Strategic Foresight Program, also the founder of Relating Systems Thinking and Design Symposium, Peter Jones. Peter, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question to Noam.
Hi, thank you. I'm happy to open. My question, especially around the responsibility of intellectuals, is how do we today break through to any type of real meaningful impact on a public agenda? You know, one of our responsibilities is to find venues where our, appropriate venues where our matters of concern can be expressed in ways that might influence thinking and find its way into various agendas, not just to impact events or to create events. So this was supposed to happen with new media. Maybe 10, 20 years ago, we saw that possibility. But now new media have converged into social media, and we're all kind of trapped into wonderful, even the Stoas, we're raising a lot of awareness with each other. Maybe there are 2,000 people in this community, but there are millions of intellectuals around the world now, and to bring our kind of voices to bear on issues is getting more distant. That is, the listeners are receding, the policy thinkers or makers are receding from the thinkers. So, can we bring old media back and recruit it in new ways? What do you see as our access points to policy?
In my view, it's a lot easier than it used to be. So take that essay that was mentioned was actually 1966. The essay is based on a talk that was given at Harvard University. Actually, surprised you to hear it, at the Hillel Society at Harvard University in 1966. Was picked up by published in their local journal, the Harvard Hillel Society Journal, was picked up by the New York Review and published and circulated. But that was the result of, at that point, about 5 years of intensive work to try to raise some concern about the Vietnam War. At that point, the Vietnam War had reached the point of virtual total destruction of South Vietnam, extending to other countries. The leading historian, military historian, Vietnam scholar, Bernard Fall, most respected, wrote at that time, same year, that he wondered whether Vietnam, South Vietnam, that meant, would survive as a cultural historical entity after the attack, an attack of scale that had never been unleashed against a country this size. There was almost no concern, okay? I started my own serious activism on this when John F. Kennedy escalated the war sharply in 1961. Couldn't talk to anybody. I was literally talking to a couple of people in a living room where a few neighbors congregated, sometimes in a church where half a dozen people would straggle in. This is in Boston, the most liberal city in the United States. We could not have a public demonstration because it would be broken up violently by counter demonstrators, many students, praised by the liberal press, most liberal journal in the country. In March 1966, right before this talk was given, there was an International Day of Protest, and we realized we couldn't have a public demonstration. That's impossible. So we decided to meet in a church, Arlington Street Church, famous church, center for a lot of dissidents. The church was attacked. There was a police cordon outside, otherwise it would have broken into it. That's the situation after years of work on this. Okay, finally broke through. Finally, there was a mass popular movement. It's much easier now. We've achieved a lot over the last years that are kind of fixed. There's a legacy. There are questions we don't have to talk about anymore. It's worth remembering what the United States was like in the 1960s. The United States in the 1960s still had anti-miscegenation laws that were so strict that the Nazis had refused to accept them because they were too harsh. Federal housing, federally supported housing, was segregated by law, not because that's what the legislators wanted, but there was no other way to get things through Congress because of the power of the Southern Democrats. The women were not regarded as having the rights of peers. They had no legal right to appear on higher level. There are new barriers, as you say. Social media are a very complicated affair. They offer opportunities. They do give you ways to reach people. They drive people into bubbles, so they're not talking to each other, and that has to be overcome. But it's not harder than it was before. I think it just means getting out there and working. We don't have to talk to each other. I give talks when I can to, I live in Arizona, to rich, gated, conservative communities. Can talk to them. They're interested. They're people. We don't agree on much, but it's possible to talk. And a lot of this can be done.
Any follow-up, Peter?
Well, well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I would just, it's good to get a sense of your history and to get a sense of where we are. My follow-up would be that now we're not so much in a US centric situation, but globalization has created a kind of new consensus that, so with respect to policy, access to policy decisions that are really beyond um, particular governing bodies. So representatives are, our representatives in the U.S. and Canada are, especially in the U.S., are more associated with corporate benefactors, and this is also taking shape globally. So I think I'm seeing there's more of a sense of consensus that certain things are well established, and that's harder to break through. And where I'm thinking about different forms of media, because there are so many voices competing. We may think that we're making a difference, and how do we take an edge in activism, or if we get co-opted pretty quickly by corporate interests.
We certainly do, but that was always the case. I think there are differences, you're right. Actually, there are some careful studies for the United States. I don't know how it works in Canada, but there are studies for the United States about what media people go to, and they're pretty interesting. There was a major study, it was published in the Business News, the free media, television, radio, press, blogs, and so on. And they were divided into Republicans and Democrats. For the Democrats, it was fair range, what you'd guess, but pretty broad range. The Republicans, Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, Breitbart, virtually nothing else. If that's the news you're getting, you're living in a different universe. And to break through that is not easy. It's very striking to see the way it works. Take a look this morning at the London Financial Times. One of the nice things about today is you can pick up the international media easily, just with a click. The best business newspaper in the Anglo-American world. It has a study of the voter, to the extent that data is available, on voters, how they voted. There's also information that just came out in the other press. Some of the things are pretty striking. Like in the United States, the Trump had locked in votes in the rural areas of the upper Midwest, where the virus is spiking and had been for weeks. And the candidates who won were those overwhelmingly were those who said we shouldn't do anything about it because it's a totalitarian effort by the government to inhibit our freedom. Okay, that's what you hear on Fox News. So we'll all die, but we'll be free from that government, terrible government. That goes back to Ronald Reagan. Government is the problem, not the solution. Let's hand decisions over to private power. That's the core of a lot of the suffering we've been living through for 40 years, raised to virtually a caricature by Trump, but he didn't invent it. So these are serious problems. And how to deal with them, as you say, is by no means easy. But we do have the means. That's the important thing.
Cool. Thank you, Peter. Jeremy Johnson, you're up next.
All right, thank you. First of all, thank you, Professor Chomsky. It's an honor to speak with you. So with the Biden presidency set to hopefully begin in 2021, the role of the left seems more critical than ever. First, to develop effective strategies that pressure the Democratic Party to substantively move towards the left. And second, what you speak about quite a bit, to address the greatest existential threat our species faces, the climate emergency. And you proposed a number of strategies to deal with this in The Climate Crisis and the Global Green New Deal, which is a recent book that just came out. My question is, how can the left, especially the public intellectual left, successfully help to shape popular discourse and support for programs like the Green New Deal, especially with the problem we have, our context with climate denialism coming from the right and dangerous incrementalism coming from the neoliberal center? What is the left's how can the left's Green New Deal function as a sort of integral and international even bridge for the material concerns of the majority?
Well, there are quite a lot of ways. First of all, one of the ways was actually illustrated by groups like Sunrise Movement or Extinction Rebellion or the Climate Strike, mostly young people, as you know. And they had an effect, a very interesting effect on the Democratic Party. The Sunrise Movement and other activists, some under the Sanders umbrella, did succeed in pushing the Democratic Party, or rather, to be precise, pushing Biden and Harris to accept a climate program, which is by no means the answer, but not bad, much better than any that had ever been proposed before. A step towards something real, aimed at least at what is necessary, net zero emissions by mid-century. Didn't have the right measures, but that could be added. Okay, that was their program. If you checked, I checked pretty regularly on the Democratic Party website because I was giving lots of talks and interviews. And if you looked up Democratic Party climate program, this is what you saw. The last time I saw it was August 22nd. A couple days later, I tried again, same click, not there. What was there was how to donate to the Democratic Party. No, I don't know what happened on the inside, but I can guess. So can you. Democratic National Committee, Clintonite, neoliberal, donor-oriented, Wall Street Party, probably just cut it out. Now, what's the task for the left? Make them put it back. Keep their feet to the fire, saying, we're going to keep after you till this program gets back and you go well beyond it, because this is not enough of a program. Now, that can be done at many levels. My co-author, Bob Pollan, the person who really wrote the active, serious programs, his work is the core of the book. He and others like him are doing a lot of things. They're working with labor unions. One of the problems is that, and you saw it in this last election pretty dramatically. I'm sure you noticed that there was a lot of surprise about what happened in South Texas, along the border in South Texas, which happens to be oil country. A large Mexican-American population, well established. They hadn't voted for a Republican in 100 years, literally. Some of the counties went Republican for the first time, and the vote shifted to Republicans. Well, when analysis was tried, there were a number of reasons, all interesting. One of them was Democrats are going to take away our jobs. Liberal commentators pointed out that Joe Biden had made a serious gaffe, serious error in the last presidential debate. Actually, he was criticized for that right at the time. At the end of the debate, he said something about, we have to think about saving human society from destruction. Those weren't his words. His words were, we have to think about transitioning from oil-based to sustainable energy, which means the same thing. He was criticized very sharply, including by the liberal press, for saying anything like that. That'll lose him the election. how can anybody come out and say we ought to try to save a world in which our grandchildren will be able to live? Horrifying. Anyway, that was the gaffe that they say lost South Texas. Now, what could have been done? What could have been done if the Democratic Party cared about these things? Of course, they don't. If they did, they would have had organizers down in South Texas telling them that you can get better jobs, better life, many more jobs if you move to sustainable energy. That's true. The programs are there. But if all people hear is Fox News, even CNN saying this is a gaffe, if that's all they hear, they say, I don't want my family to starve. I don't care what you guys are thinking about. It's probably a fake anyway. So I'm not going to listen to you and lose my job. Well, that can be overcome, but not by going like that. You have to work. And it's interesting that in Latino communities where activism was proceeding, had been for years, like where I live, in fact, in Arizona, there had been major Latino organizing in the urban areas mainly. Had been very effective. Community swung the election to the Democrats. If that had happened in South Texas, would have happened there too. That's how you reach people. Tell them, explain, look, you got real problems. You're not going to have a job in the oil fields. That's impossible. Life can't continue that way. But there are better ways, and they're available, and here they are. So let's work on them. So that can be done, but it takes direct activism, organizing, and among what are called intellectuals, try to explain to them that Biden's comment was not a gaffe. It's your reaction, which is not just a gaffe, but a crime. You should be praising him for that. You should be amplifying it. You shouldn't have been ignoring and denying it. That should be a headline every day. Now we have to do this. That's your community of liberal intellectuals. You're not doing it in your own community, let alone going out and doing it elsewhere. Okay, that's something to be addressed at every level. And it's remarkable that it's been in the hands of young people to do it. If you haven't seen it yet, you should look at a short video which should be shown in every classroom in every country in the world. It's the opening session of last January's Davos conference. Every January, the people who call themselves the masters of the universe gather in a fancy ski resort in Switzerland, have fun, have parties, tell each other how wonderful they are, and so on. It's an interesting meeting. Last January, the Davos meeting opened with two talks. One of them, naturally, was the chief master of the universe, Donald Trump. He gave the opening talk. It's worth looking at. Kind of ranting, self-congratulatory kind of thing you're used to. The audience was kind of writhing in embarrassment. That spoils the image they're trying to project of dedicated humanists and so on. Nevertheless, they gave him a rousing standing applause because there was one line in there which he didn't forget to put in. I'm going to make sure to enrich you. That's all they have to hear. They can tolerate the antics as long as that's right in the center, as it's been in his entire legislative program. So then after that performance, there was a second speech by 17-year-old girl, Greta Thunberg, quiet, factual, measured, describing the reality of what's happening, and ending up by looking at the audience and saying, You have betrayed us. She got some polite applause, and then, nice girl, go back to school. We'll take care of it. Okay, it's really worth looking at. That's the two worlds we're living in. Now we have to decide which one's going to prevail.
Do you have a follow-up question, Jeremy?
Just a brief one. Thank you, Professor Chomsky. I think part of the issue here, and you've talked about this quite a bit in 2019 at the recent summit, Internationalism or Extinction. The follow-up question would be, how do we shape a international consensus for what needs to be done? I think it's so important. And the climate, of course, that we're in is kind of, there's a reactionary response against internationalism. It's associated with globalization or job loss or other kind of xenophobic turns. So how do we foster a healthy internationalism right now in this context?
That's a serious problem. You're right. Every single problem we face, whether it's environmental catastrophe, threat of nuclear war, decline of democracy, pandemic, it's all international. And we have to understand where the opposition to what's called globalization is coming from. A lot of it is xenophobia, hatred of immigrants, racism, and so on. And I should say, Trump has been a genius at tapping every poisonous current that is just barely below the surface in the society and raising it to the surface. He's done that brilliantly. But he's also tapped something else, which is real and justified. We lost our jobs. Why did they lose their jobs? Because the neoliberal globalization determines that whether you have a job or not depends on a bunch of rich bankers in New York and Chicago. You don't run your enterprises. They're run by a bunch of super rich people who have no interest in you, no interest in your communities, just want more money in their pockets. That's neoliberalism, okay? I mean, didn't begin it, but it dramatically escalated it. And that's 40 years. And in this 40 years, a lot of things have happened. Predictable. Go back to the beginning. Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. Reagan's inaugural speech is, government is the problem, not the solution. That doesn't mean decisions go away. It just means they're transferred somewhere else. To private power, unaccountable private power. And they got a lesson right away from Milton Friedman, the leading economist of neoliberalism. Wrote an important article right then, influential article, saying the sole responsibility of a corporation is self-enrichment. Nothing else. They have no further responsibilities. Well, put those two things together. Decisions over life have to go into the hands of corporations, which have the sole responsibility of self-enrichment. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what's going to happen. And we now have a record of it, 40 years record. There was just a study that came out by the Rand Corporation, very respectable corporation, tried to do a study of how much wealth had been transferred in the last 40 years from the working class and the middle class, the lower 90% of the population, how much wealth had been transferred them to the very rich. Their estimate is $47 trillion. Now, people don't know the statistics. They can see it in their lives. And it's not just the rich, it's the ultra rich. So the top 0.1% of the population, not 0.1%, have doubled their wealth from 10% of total wealth to 20%. While for the rest, it's stagnation, decline, precarious existence, loss of benefits, and so on. Well, people are angry. They're upset. Then you get Bill Clinton coming along with the Globalization Project, World Trade Organization, NAFTA, put it in fancy words if you like, but what it means is your job is in the hands of some rich bankers in New York and Chicago, okay? And they're going to send them abroad because they can make more money. Well, that leads to justified resentments. And Trump, who's a con man, he's harming the working class more than anyone you can imagine, but he's at least pretending to be standing up for them. The Democrats don't even try. They're just a party of affluent professional elites. They don't try anything else. Trump at least says, I love you, while at the same time he's stabbing you in the back. Okay, let's vote for him. These are serious problems. Trump amplified them. You have them in Canada too, but they're very real and deep.
Cool. Thank you, Jeremy. Benita Roy, you're up next. I just asked you to unmute yourself.
Wow, so this is a great pleasure. I've been reading your stuff for over 40 years. And it's become a big part of the way I look at the world. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to reflect that back to you. My question, I want to make it, interweave it with what you were just saying about the distinction between neoliberal globalism and your concept of internationalism. I think that's a distinction that the progressive left needs to make much, much more clear. So my question, I want to put it in that context. It wasn't originally in that context, but this is very rich. My question is, in a recent interview for The Atlantic, Obama talked about how he anticipated a conservative populism as a backlash, but he expected it to come in the form of strong traditional values. He talks about John Wayne and Clint Eastwood in the American imagination, not in the form of a Trump. Since most of the world's people hold traditional values, is it possible to integrate that with internationalism? Or is internationalism inevitably bound up with cosmopolitan values? Is there any room for traditional values in internationalism as you are thinking about it?
Well, what are traditional values? Are they the values of the Gospels, for example? That you should have a preferential option for the poor? That you should have, are they the values of the prophets of the Old Testament? You should have mercy for widows and orphans. Are those traditional values? About as traditional as I can think of. And I don't see why they can't be international values. They're the exact opposite of the values that Trump stands for. If you take a look at the traditional values that he's trying to bring to the fore, they do exist. They're the values of white supremacy. That's a traditional value in the United States, very deeply rooted. If you look at close studies of Republicans, turns out almost half of them think it's about time we should be turning to the use of force to preserve traditional values. They're not talking about the values of the Gospels or of the prophets. They're talking of the values that allowed us to keep our jackboot on the necks of Afro-Americans for 400 years. And we're losing that they can see that a majority of births in the United States, a majority now, are for non-whites. They see themselves as a shrinking majority, which will soon be a minority, and they want to preserve that, us above everyone else. That's also a traditional value, and it's not new. You take a look at the history of the United States. Not that Canada is that much different, but I'll take the United States. The United States supported free and open immigration as long as it was necessary to bring in a white European population to replace the indigenous population that was being exterminated. Exterminated, the word used by the founding fathers. So as the so-called national territory was conquered, you had to replace the empty spaces by proper white people. So they were brought in. By the late 19th century, Chinese were excluded. That was the first exclusion. 1924 was the first racist immigration act. It was aimed against Jews and Italians. Those were not the words. The words were East Europeans and Southern Europeans, which meant Jews and Italians who weren't quite white, not quite. That's why millions died in the Holocaust. My extended family, for example, they couldn't come to the United States. They were barred by the immigration laws and by actions to prevent immigrants from coming here. That lasted until 1965, that law. Then along come others, which you're familiar with, about immigrants coming in, okay? This is a deep current. Well, that's one kind of traditional value. There's another kind of traditional value which has its deep roots in our, what we claim to be our tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, if you read the actual books, okay? So which traditional values is the question? Just a final comment on Obama. His rhetoric is very nice. Take a look at what he did. He came into office in 2008. Lots of promises, hope and change, people excited, working people voted for him, we'll finally get some change. He had control of Congress, Senate and the House for 2 years. It was the midst of the housing and financial crisis. Congress passed legislation, bailout legislation, which had two parts. One part was to bail out the perpetrators of the crisis, the banks and investment firms, which have been carrying out really criminal activities, financial manipulations, subprime mortgages, which they know would never be paid, predatory lending practices. That's what caused it. So we have to bail them out, of course. There was another part of the legislation, support for the people who had lost their homes and who had lost their jobs, the victims of foreclosures and others. That part of the legislation was never implemented. In fact, when it was occasionally brought up in internal discussions, it was ridiculed. Well, again, people don't have to know the details. They could see the effects. And by 2010, 2 years, you saw the effects. I was then living in Massachusetts, where I've lived most of my life, liberal state. There was an election in 2010 to replace Ted Kennedy's position. The liberal lion had died. So it was a runoff election. It was won by a Republican. People were furious. Union voters didn't vote Democratic. They were betrayed. They listened to Obama's pretty words. They saw what happened. Okay, what happened to them a couple of years later? Voted for Trump. There's a lot of things to look at. Pretty words don't suffice. People can see what's happening.
Any follow-up, B?
Yeah, I'm trying to keep it to a small piece. So if I want to pivot to the notion of parochialism, and the fact is most of the people in the world have parochial values. This is just a truth we have to live with. And my question is there a way that internationalism, is there room for parochial values? So when you first started talking about traditional values, some of them are workable. There's some good and truth in all, perhaps not all, but in many parochial values. And is there room for them in internationalism as you understand it? I know it's not a clear question, but
It's a clear question.
Oh, okay, thank
And
you.
I think we have some information about it. We have a lot of information about people's attitudes. It's especially in the United States, very intensively studied country for public attitudes, polls, and so on. Sometimes it's pretty remarkable if you look at them. There's a pretty good book on it by Benjamin Page, a well-known media analyst. It's called The Democratic Disconnect or something like that, in which he reviews attitudes on internationalism, among other things. Turns out, this is, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago, but it's no different now. Turns out most people think that the United Nations should take the lead on international issues, and we should follow the international consensus, even if we don't like it. A bare majority felt that the veto power should be given up because there should be a general decision as to what should be done. You look at attitudes on, say, foreign aid. That's very interesting. You ask people, what do you think about foreign aid? They say it's way too high. Shouldn't be giving all this away to those worthless people. Second question, what do you think foreign aid ought to be? Much higher than what it actually is, which people radically overestimate. Okay, well, what does that mean? I think that's internationalism. And you see it on the right as well. George W. Bush was not my favorite president by any means, but he did initiate an AIDS program in Africa, which was very effective. That's genuine internationalism. Trump, of course, kills everything, all programs. But this is the last Republican president who was, again, not our favorite. Okay. It's worth thinking about just concern for the welfare of the country. Some interesting comparisons. Take Richard Nixon. Again, not my favorite president or yours, I'm sure. In 1960, he had good reason to believe that the election was stolen by Democratic Party machinations in the Democrat-controlled cities. He didn't challenge the result. He put the welfare of the country ahead of his personal ambitions. That was the right wing of the Republican Party in 1960. Fast forward to today. The idea of putting the welfare of the country before your personal ambitions, it's not even expressible. Well, there's a lot we can do about that too.
All right. Thank you, Benita. Matt Siegel or Segal, you're up next.
And Professor Chomsky, thank you for being with us today and for your entire lifetime of thought and activism. It's a tremendous honor to speak with you and to ask a question. This kind of dovetails on Benita's question about traditional values. And I appreciated your response in asking, well, what do we mean by traditional values? If we mean those spiritual values actually articulated in the texts, the books that our traditions say are sacred, then maybe those can be in service of an international solidarity movement. But often traditionalists, self-described, don't necessarily hold to the Gospels of to the values of the Gospels or to the values of the Old Testament prophets. So my question for you is related in the sense that I wonder, when we engage as intellectuals trying to bring about political change, if the points of leverage are merely to speak to material conditions, to speak to economics, to speak to jobs and people's ability to earn a living. Obviously, that's important for leftist intellectuals to speak to that. But I wonder if the left needs to offer more than just secular liberalism or more than just scientific socialism, if there's a need for the left to really seriously engage with religion and spirituality and with the arts in a way that maybe might be difficult. I mean, there's the cultural left now that does engage it at a level that's not just material conditions, but focuses on identity, race and gender and so on, and has made tremendously important progress, and has provoked a reaction from the white majority in the country by focusing on identity. But is there another form of cultural activity that the left can engage in that would be, rather than about identities that divide us, about a deeper form of spiritual identity maybe, or cosmic and ecological identity perhaps, that brings us together? Can the left address that cultural issue in service of political transformation, or should we really just focus on the material and the economic?
I think the left should be concerned with all of these issues. Sometimes it's not called the left, but I don't know what that term means, but let's take the 1980s, okay, not the 60s. In the 1980s, in the United States, there developed what is, in my view, the most remarkable left social movement in history. It wasn't called left. It was the Solidarity movement with Central America. Who was involved? Rural churches, evangelical churches, people from mainstream, right in the mainstream, who went to Central America to try to work with people who were under vicious attack, to help them, even to give them whatever protection you could give with a white face around. I mean, I remember speaking in churches, in right conservative evangelical churches in rural areas, Kansas, Maryland, where people knew more about Central America than professional intellectuals did, because they were there. They were up and back. What was going on? Ronald Reagan was waging a major terrorist war against Central America. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, religious martyrs. The decade opened with the assassination of an archbishop, ended 1989 with the assassination of 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals, Jesuit priests, leading Latin American intellectuals, all by the same hands, elite units armed and trained by the United States. That's what the government was doing. What the population was doing at a local level, including very traditional sectors, was going down there to try to help people resist. Notice that that has never happened in the entire history of imperialism. Never. No Americans in the 1960s, including the most activist, went to live in a Vietnamese village. No French citizens went to live in an Algerian village to help and protect the people. The British never did it. Nobody ever did it. This is a kind of traditionalist internationalism that came from the central main roots of traditional American society. It's there. And in fact, it's quite interesting to look at what happened in the Catholic Church. You're not supposed to talk about this. It's one of those hidden topics. But just like what I just described as a hidden topic, though it's pretty spectacular. Notice, first time in the history of imperialism. It's pretty significant. What happened with the church? Well, in 1962, Pope John the 23rd called Vatican II, Second Main Vatican Council. His idea was to try to return the church to the Gospels. That was a pretty radical move. He was trying to go back to the period before the 4th century, when the church was taken over by Constantine, became the religion of the Roman Empire. Hans Kuhn, historian of Christianity, described it as a change from the church of the persecuted to the church of the persecutors in the 4th century. And in 1962, an effort to turn it back to the church of the persecuted, to press forward the radical pacifist message of the Gospels, the preferential option for the poor, was taken up by Latin American bishops, priests, nuns, lay people. They went out to poor communities, started groups where they would read the Gospels, not just, incant them in Latin, but read what they said and say and think about them and use and begin to organize to try to take control of your lives, miserable, persecuted lives. Something happened. The United States came down with a hammer blow, launched a war against the church, supported by right-wing elements in the Vatican and others, to try to crush this heresy. And that's why you have a long string of religious martyrs, including the Archbishop in El Salvador and the assassinated priests in 1989. And if you take a look at, and the United States government officially takes pride in having destroyed it, officially. You take the School of the Americas. They changed the name recently because there was too much negative propaganda. But the training school for Latin American killers, that's what it is actually. Now they have what they call talking points, advertising about how wonderful they are. One of them is the United States Army helped defeat liberation theology. Liberation theology is what I just described. Okay? That's part of history too. Well, it's kind of traditional values. The question is which ones we pick.
Matt, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you. Yes, liberation theology and what has transpired in South America in decades past is a great example of the way that these traditional values can be mobilized in service of aid to the poor and a shift away from society driven by profit toward a society that would be driven by love and human flourishing. I wonder, just as a brief follow-up, Professor Chomsky, if you might give your opinion on as to whether Christianity in its various institutional forms in the United States, I mean, the Catholic Church has a presence here, obviously, but there are untold numbers of other denominations, Protestant denominations. Is there any point to trying to, for progressives, to try to reclaim some of the territory in that cultural space, or do we need to work along other avenues? Is it a lost cause at this point?
I don't think it's a lost cause. What I described about the 1980s is not that remote in history. And there are efforts inside the evangelical churches to try to recover that spirit and commitment. Okay? I don't think these struggles are at all finished. They change. I mean, take, say, the labor movement. You look at American history, has a very violent labor history, very violent, much worse than Canada or Europe. In the 1920s, the labor movement had been crushed, mostly by Woodrow Wilson's repression, state repression and corporate repression. In the 1930s, it revived, became a major force. It's my childhood, I remember it very well. Led to the New Deal, made a big difference, moved the United States towards some kind of social democracy. Well, since one of the main goals of the neoliberal efforts has been to crush the labor movement, both Reagan and Thatcher began in their first days with moves to try to crush the labor movement. They've been pretty successful, but it's reviving again in interesting places. In the red states, places like West Virginia and Arizona, and teacher strikes, strikes of service workers, non-unionized. In fact, the unions aren't even in favor of it. They're getting tremendous popular support. Happened to be in Arizona. The teacher strikes are very important. The state has sharply cut back funding for education as part of the neoliberal programs of destroying public education. It's pretty extreme here. It's been a pretty reactionary state. Teachers were not just calling for better wages, which they deserve, but are calling for improvement of the educational system. Fewer children in a class, better facilities, more nurses in schools, things like that. From enormous support. You drive around Tucson where I live, there's signs supporting the teachers everywhere. Well, that's the same in West Virginia. These are coming from what are considered the most reactionary parts of the country. I think there's plenty of room there.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Matt. Noam, we're at the bottom of the hour. Do you have time for one more question, or do you have to go right now?
Okay, let's pick one more. I'll try to be briefer.
All right. Evan, you are up.
All right. So let's see. I'm so glad to get to ask you this question today. So my question is, what are your thoughts on strategies or tactics which might help protect the ideal of freedom of speech from becoming excessively associated with the political left or right or other tribal groups? Just appreciate hearing your thoughts, and thank you for your time.
Tactics, I'm sorry, for what specifically?
So it seems that over the past few decades, free speech as an ideal was associated with the left in, say, the 60s and 70s, and now it's shifting to being associated with the political right in recent times. This seems damaging to the quality of discourse to me, and so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on strategies or tactics for making that happen less.
Well, first we should remember that what is now called cancel culture is the standard procedure of the establishment. They've been doing it forever. I could give you plenty of examples just from my own history. Books destroyed, publishers destroyed, blocked from public radio, programs canceled. It's normal, except it's always been directed against the left, so nobody cared. Now what's happening is that segments of the left are picking up the same tactics. It's a very serious error, in my opinion. First of all, it's wrong in principle, and it's just tactically idiotic. It's a gift to the far right. They love it. Trump ran his whole campaign on it. Somebody is invited to talk at your university, you don't like him, so you drive him off campus. He's delighted. He gets 10 times as much publicity as he had before. he can stand up and say, I'm defending liberal values against these neo-fascists. He wins, it's tactically ridiculous, wrong in principle. It has made life difficult in many circles. People are afraid they might have used the wrong pronoun, or they might have said something that might offend somebody. It's not a way to live. That's not the way to have a serious interchange among people. You have to respect each other. So yes, you don't go around putting up a poster in somebody's living room saying, kill the kikes, let's say. No, you don't do that. But you can have a serious discussion about whether, say, affirmative action is the right policy and how you should carry it out. You can have a civilized discussion about that without being subjected to imprecations and abuse. I think civilized discourse is crucial and critical. Should be the left that's upholding it, and they should not join by picking up the worst tactics of the right wing.
So I take it that heart meant Evan is satisfied. So Professor Chomsky, any closing thoughts for us before we close out today?
There's one important thought, I think, which is worth reiterating. We have very serious problems. Problem of environmental catastrophe has to be dealt with soon, in the next decade or two. We can't wait. The deterioration of democracy, deterioration of civilized discourses, the last commentator just mentioned, all serious problems. The threat of nuclear weapons, which is growing, is a very serious problem. We can go on. The pandemic is a serious problem. Every one of these problems has a solution. We know answers to them, feasible answers, all of them. The opportunities are there. It's not enough to just know. You have to grasp the opportunities, and that can be done.
Very cool. And I'm being pressured to ask you this inside joke. What do you think of the word meta? All right. Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today. We would love to have you back anytime. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.
All right, everyone. You can go to thestoa.ca to check out our events. We have a Patreon if you'd like to support us stealing the culture here at the Stoa, and Substack for updates. That being said, Professor Chomsky, everyone, thank you for coming to the Stoa.
Very much.